wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful girl.
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
With wonderful people all over this country. She is a beauty, beautiful.
Welcome to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. With Devin Bissoon as our technical operator tonight, as usual. We are discussing tonight, August 3rd, Emancipation. Emancipation was on August 1st. Our guest tonight is Professor Dr. Nehusi, as well as the great Ravindra Dev. Gentlemen, welcome both. Viewers, listeners, thank you for joining us this evening. Let's delve right into our topic. First, I would like to, before we get into it, if you could define this concept of emancipation, what it means. So, Nehusi, you want to give us a shot since you are the esteemed professor?
We're all professors here. Thank you very much, Vishnu, and thanks once again to our host and the owner of this establishment. Thanks also, and a special shout out to all listeners, and of course to my fellow panelists. I think that defining emancipation is extremely important, and I'm glad that you've invited this discussion, Vishnu. For me, emancipation is not an event. I know usually when we say emancipation, we run into a number of inaccuracies in my view. Not inaccuracy in a certain sense of the word, but it's inaccurate to see emancipation as something that happened so many years ago, 100 and odd years ago, 200 years ago, as though it's an event. It's not an event. Emancipation is a process, and I'll put forward further that emancipation is always going to be a process that decent human beings are engaged in. Because once you've won one battle, there are other things for you to emancipate yourself from. So I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully I'll come back to say exactly why it's a process. And I think there's a great danger of us accepting the enslaver's definition of our reality. And the question of emancipation is one of them.
So we commemorated emancipation on August 1st, Monday. No, sorry, Tuesday. Was it Monday, Tuesday? Tuesday, yeah. And today, oh, I thought today's the 3rd, today's the 2nd. And so we were commemorating it. It was commemorated all over the Caribbean, Guyana included, and as well as in Toronto, there were a commemoration of Emancipation Day. People commemorate a lot of events and so on and so forth. And it brings back to me memories of my studies of studying the Irish liberation struggle, the Irish people, and their principles for commemoration. I wonder if Ravi Dev could just give us a little background of that, and if you could delve right into the African Emancipation commemoration.
Well, let me first of all talk a bit about emancipation, and I totally agree with Kimani of emancipation, which is seen as liberation. It's not an event, but a process. And a process in this case that started before August 1st. And we should delve into that, what was in that process, because means, as we know, has tremendous effect on ends. And in fact, one philosopher says, ends are merely consummated means. So it'd be interesting to look at the means that were used or claimed to be to deliver emancipation. But I'll go forward a little bit further into the present and quote this lady, Hannah Arendt, who talks about liberation, which can be seen as emancipation. It may be the condition of freedom, but by does it lead automatically to it? And I think that's what I understand it to be, a process that you may have this event of, let's say, okay, we've liberated you in this particular case. And yes, liberation is antecedent to this thing called freedom, but it is freedom. The implication that freedom has arrived is what is problematical, both theoretically and in the case of the Caribbean, totally, I think is arguable as to whether it arrived then, or even if it has even arrived today. And that is what I think we need to talk about and face it frontally in the Caribbean, because there's a lot of people running around, talking about emancipation, and I wonder if they have ever examined it. To come back to your question, many people would be interested to know that the Irish were seen around the time of the so-called emancipation as they were called white Negroes by some people, and their condition what they would feel was problematical. And in coming to the present, they at least are a bit more nuanced, that when they talk about emancipation and when you talk about commemoration or any event, they, about a decade ago, they decided to set some criteria. And the first thing they said, let us be clear on the historical facts. That at least, even if it's a chronicle, let us try to be clear on the historical facts of the event we are commemorating. And this, again, in Guyana, is still not something that is very clear. How many slaves were shipped into Guyana? Africans were shipped into Guyana as slaves. Arrived. What kind of work were they doing? People talk about us coming to sugar plantations. For most of Guyana's history, it was coffee and cotton. These are facts that we need to agree on first. And then we can talk about to recognize the implications of that event that we are commemorating. So if we are commemorating emancipation, which is to come out of that hundreds of years of slavery, what are the implications of that process of enslavement? And could we, with the stroke of a pen, erase all of that? So we should recognize and talk about the implications of the process and as to what happened. And finally, we must also accept that there will be different perceptions, different interpretations of the facts. Let us be clear on the facts, but there may be, and that is normal. We all have, to say truth may be perspectival, and we recognize, therefore, that when we look back, we always look back at a particular present. And the present, as one school of history says, the question and answer one, that each present presents different questions. So at our stage of development in Guyana, we should understand the different questions that will be asked, the different perceptions we may have, and the different interpretations. And we should use these events, and this is to me very important in Guyana where we are today, that we should use these events that we are commemorating, not for deepening divisions that may exist, but to deepen our understanding of that particular event and its period, so that we, as the inhabitants of this land called Guyana, may better understand each other. And that is what I would call a more positive approach to what we ought to be engaged in.
Very good, excellent. Naomi, anything to add to that? And
Yeah.
Want to address that?
Yeah. I want to develop what past the definition of emancipation that I gave and ask a question, which I think is the question, because, like I said, emancipation, you just don't emancipate yourself. You know, it has to be emancipation from a specific condition or a specific number of things. And usually, when we talk about emancipation, we talk about the legal termination of physical enslavement or some aspects of physical enslavement. Now, this is important because what happened during enslavement, colonialism, neocolonialism, which we currently are residing in, these are just varying aspects of what is essentially the same process and almost the same condition of European domination of us and other peoples, Western European domination. And we need to be very clear about what happened to bring about what we call emancipation that we are commemorating. African people were enslaved. And although Africans resisted, and I'm going to come to that in a moment, it's also important to understand that this wasn't merely a physical confinement. African culture was outlawed. Many African people were disconnected from our history. We have been living in a permanent crisis of identity since then. We don't know who we are. There are many people today, if you walked up to them and say, "How are you, my African brother or sister?" they want to fight you because they're convinced that Africa is and has always been a backward place. They're convinced that to be African is not something that's honorable and attractive. Where did we get those visions from, those views of ourselves from? We got it from the people who enslaved us, because enslavement wasn't merely a physical process. It was a mental process of denigrating Africa and placing Europe upon a pedestal. Anything white or European is good. Anything black or African is bad. That's a crude generalization, but it fits. You know, African culture. You know, if two of us, I think I gave this one on the show already, two African people got a white sheet on the table and burning candles and incense, everybody's going to say they're walking over. There's a bad thing. But those very people are going to go to a Catholic church where the identical thing happens and they never see anything bad about it. But they don't know that the Catholic Church got it from Africa. And it's this kind of crass contradiction in our existence that we need to come to understand. When Bob Marley said, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves could free our minds," he's talking about the need to kick on from what happened on the 1st of August, 1838. And let me say something else here. We were not emancipated. Europeans were forced by increasing resistance, sophistication, and frequency of resistance, plus certain economic changes that were coming in, to give up the physical enslavement of African people. We are largely, but not only, responsible. The kind of the churchmen and the abolitionist movement, the humanitarian movement that white and white-minded scholars like to boast upon as the major source of the Emancipation Act is just plain wrong. They played a role, but not as large as what is often claimed about them. So to say that African people were emancipated is to give the white, backward, European, racist view of the process. That's number one. Number two, to claim that it was an event, full stop, it happened in history, and we have no reason for continuing it. That's also false. It's self-defeating. African people, fact is, all Guyanese, all people who were oppressed, have or should have an interest in emancipation. Indian people, Chinese, Portuguese, and Native Americans were very much affected by European colonization, but not as much as the African people. So all of us have an interest in emancipation. The economic system we live under, largely the education system, the social system, the spiritual system for many of us are still infected, and I really do mean that word very strongly, still infected by European constructs. In many instances, we're totally dominated. Look at our economy. You know, we're almost totally dominated by the design Europeans made and enforced upon us. So when we want to talk about emancipation, it's not only African business, it's all Guyanese business. And even if we want to talk about the theoretical and practical question of how African Guyanese are going to repossess ourselves and build an economy and build real independence, it's still, I believe, an interest to other Guyanese, because we should all be interested in the welfare of each other. We should not want to see another group of Guyanese in the lurch, so to speak. And I think these are some important points that we need to be debating and educating ourselves about why it is that we need greater and greater emancipation. We just don't imagine emancipation to be something that happened so many hundreds of years ago. And if I may, let me just add this. One of the obvious struggles we have in our society today is the struggle against climate change, the encroaching seawall. We have to emancipate ourselves from that kind of danger. That's another way in which emancipation is relevant. We want to talk about gender equity. That's a very important point. If we hold back the progress of women and girls, more than 50% of our population, how sensible is that? It's downright stupid. And men have got to recognize that that's part of our struggle. You know, so these are just other examples of emancipation tasks that we have to undertake in our society, consciously and together.
Ravidev, it's a long dissertation. You agree?
Kimani is giving us a macro view and touching on many areas. I will try to look at aspects of what he has spoken about. Coming back to the Irish thesis, let's start from historical facts. And this is where our complaint that history ought to be taught from nursery all the way to graduate schools as a compulsory subject. Our educational, so-called educational curriculum must be geared to our needs to liberate our mind to live in this world. And I think it's a travesty that history is almost a side thought in our curriculum here, and we're talking about all kinds of education and scholarships and all that. And I'll come back to that. I want to start with this notion of the act in 1833 that was passed. And it says this: an act for one, the abolition of we think of emancipation, that this act abolished a legal condition called slavery. And that was all that it did. But we know legality does not encompass all of what one's life is. It's only one aspect of it. And that legal aspect, since it's coming from those who rule the society, can be changed at the whim and fancy of those. So already we have a problematical beginning of this act that we boast about of emancipation. It merely legally abolished slavery, but this is the critical part. It went on to say, secondly, it was for the promotion of the industry of the manumitted slaves. So the act, the British were telling us very clearly that, you know something, these people aren't ready. First of all, we have to now teach them about industry, how to work. These people were working for 200-300 years in this country, built the cotton industry that provided the raw material for the Industrial Revolution of England through the mills of Lancashire. They produced all of that. They produced coffee, as I said. My village of Iflat was originally a coffee plantation. Then when sugar, became a staple in Europe, we went on to sugar. But yet, at abolition, this act is supposed to promote industry in these manumitted slaves. And that's important. You see, they are still slaves. They are still not human. They are merely manumitted slaves. Those who, quote unquote, abolished slavery still saw them as a category of slaves. Words have meaning. And in this case here, if we go back even to the language of the abolitionists, those who are given so much credit that we name a village after one of them,
Several
they themselves.
Several villages.
Yeah, I'm saying the one in Pakistan, talk about that clear one that everybody talks about. Because I'll tell you something, just in terms of that whole need to educate them. William Wilberforce, who was one of the first leaders of the anti-slavery movement, he argued in 1823, the same year as we had the East Coast rebellion, as to what exactly is not manumission, but amelioration. They were supposed to ease their condition. And here is what Wilberforce said: to grant freedom to the slaves immediately. I'm quoting him. To grant freedom to the slaves immediately would be to ensure not only their master's ruin, but their own. They must first be trained and educated to freedom. So these slaves, of course, they had been made into slaves because they claimed they didn't have a soul. They were subhuman. So this is a further extrapolation of that, even at that moment that is now coming, called emancipation, that we are all jumping up and down and screaming kumbaya. Here is the man himself telling you that they need to be trained and educated. And I use those words in quotation marks because I come back to what Nehusi said earlier in terms of this mental slavery. Because what did they do? And I want to mention too, and I think we should go into it because they still are with us. First of all, there was that 4-year period that was called apprenticeship. You weren't doing this to the slaves to let them have to keep on working as before for no money for X amount of hours, and only when they went beyond those hours, they were going to be paid. No. So all that labor that they provided for another 4 years was for their benefit, you see. They were to be trained for freedom. Now, some people argue, a lot of scholars say, well, man, this was a new market economy. And nowadays we also hear this word market economy. So when these individuals had been enslaved, the fact that they had provision grounds and that they planted and grew vegetables and all kinds of crops, they reared pigs and various kinds of animals, goats and pigs and sheep and all that. and then sold them at markets on Sunday and saved their money during slavery. I'm talking about. How many people know that in Guyana? So yet hundreds of years of doing that didn't prepare them to deal with money, you see. But it is the kind of argument that we have to dissect when we talk even of this so-called act of emancipation. It was a fraud because those people now had to be trained. And what were they to be trained for, right? It was now to be trained for this same giving your labor at the least cost. You know, so this was the birth of capitalism. Eric Williams wrote about capitalism and slavery, and they are coterminous. You know, Marxists will argue about, man, that was not real capitalism. It wasn't developed yet. Commodity. Well, the bodies of the slaves were commodities, buddy. What do you mean they weren't commodities? They were commodified. That slave was alienated from his own body, much less his labor. His body was not his own. He was a chattel. He was simply like a cow or a mule or a pig. You understand? And coming back to owning, the irony about slaves having ownership, it was the fact when on where humanity comes from in Eskimo Coast, you get me? When Damon led that uprising, what did he start at 1834? It wasn't just that they were upset about the fact emancipation didn't come immediately. The manager of that plantation killed about 56 pigs. You understand? You went and tried to immediately destroy their way of life. 56 pigs ain't 2 cents worth. You understand? Meaning these people had capital. You understand? So coming back to training them and getting them ready, I want to talk about two institutions that are still here with us. One, after the so-called apprenticeship, by 1838, the police force was formed. Note this. So the force that was used on those Africans during slavery wasn't completely removed. It was now legalized and put in the hands of the state in a police force. And now I say the police force was formed in 1838, but everybody says, well, it's 1839 actually. But it's an important distinction. After they went to England, those who they sent were going to lead this police force. The police force in England was the London Metropolitan Force, the so-called bobbies of Robert Peel. They walked around with batons and, you know, no guns. But they discovered that over in Ireland, there was an Irish constabulary formed to suppress and oppress and pacify the Irish. And that was an armed force. That police force was an armed force, unlike the one for England. So the police force that we got in Guyana from the word go in 1839 was an armed force that could exercise what became the meaning of a state, which is to have the control of life and death over you. So the control of life and death passed from the planter to the state. And who controlled the state for the next 100 years plus? The same planters. You understand? So when we hear of individuals, when they will now define it as riot. So we got something called the Riot Act. So rather than having the slave owners chop their heads off and sticking it on a spear, a pike, you now had the police reading the Riot Act and mowing you down. Just like that. What's the difference? And I want to come back to our complaints about the police force in the present and where that came from after slavery. We note that these police stations were near all the major slave owning areas. We had one in Leonora, one in Denamstel, and they're still there because that is where the slaves were expected to rebel. Denamstel, of course, would quickly have bought their own land there. So to come back to the other institution, I want to close. I know I'm carrying on, and I don't want to rival my professorial panelists
Ravi, you've been on for many times more than I have been.
So, so the last one would be to educate those individuals. We had two institutions that are still with us and are still very important, especially in the African Guyanese community, and people boast about it, not realizing the irony. And those two institutions are the church. The church is one institution, and the second one were the schools. They came out coterminously because, in fact, the church controlled the schools. So I leave it at that, and I think we need to say if there was ever any emancipation, then how were they given or delivered by those institutions?
So Ravi, Dr. Kimani, Ravi has given us a lot to chew, a lot to analyze: the state, the police, the plantocracy, and he's suggesting that nothing really changed from slavery to immediate post-slavery.
The only thing different between what Ravi has said and what I have written and published and have given lectures on is the terminology. And I think I mentioned on Globespan already that I do not call my ancestors slaves. They were not slaves. They were enslaved Africans. And I think at this point, I need to explain why. I mentioned in my introduction that perception, people's perceptions of each other were changed in the process of enslavement, colonization, and neo-colonization. And I think it's important for us to see the broader implications of something that Ravi correctly mentioned, and it's something that we all talk about. African people were stripped of our identity. I said we are in a permanent crisis of identity. What does that mean? We don't know who we are. And we easily accept the negative definitions of ourselves and our circumstances, reality, given to us by the people who oppress us. And it's a problem of the historiography of Guyana and other parts of the Caribbean and the oppressed world. And I think it's important for us to stop and recognize that anytime we say words like emancipation, these Africans were emancipated, manumitted slaves, we are actually articulating the point of view of the biggest criminals ever in human history. And I'm talking about the enslavers of Africans, who were the same people who put Indian people and Chinese and Portuguese people on the indentureship and exploited all of us. The ravages of culture and identity and economic productivity and so on were different. But we are all victims of the same set of people and what's essentially the same process of oppression and exploitation. And we mustn't imagine that these processes were independent of the language used, the terminology used to describe them. And if we are really going to decolonize ourselves, if we're really going to emancipate ourselves from what was inflicted upon us, then we will have to look at this question of language as an extremely important aspect of our occupation. Because language is not merely words. Language is the evidence of a people's progress through space and time. It also tells you what those people thought, how they were thinking about different things. And therefore, when we look at human beings and we call them slaves, and yes, Ravi, you're very right. African people did not even own our own bodies. Now, these are things that people who call themselves Christians did, and I'm going to come back to that. We, African people, were listed among cows and sheep and goats and other estate animals, tools. That's how these Christians thought about us. And if we cannot face that fact, we're not going to emancipate ourselves. So you're right, Ravi, I agree with you. We have to understand what happened on those plantations. One thing you did not mention was the rapes of men, women, boys, and girls. What are the psychological consequences of that kind of vulgarity? African men and women who led rebellions were publicly sodomized. It was ritualized. The evil, the collective violence was ritualized on the plantations. Do we teach our children that? So why do we not know, or we tend not to know about these things? What are the living consequences of this? And I'm talking about the psychological implications of that. Because even white psychology says today that trauma is inherited and passed down from generation to generation to generation. So African people have to combat this. We have to repair ourselves. And there's a whole area of reparations that we will need to talk about. Reparations is not only getting money. We need to get money because we've been owed. And our societies, our families, our clans, our villages, our communities, and as a result, Guyana has been impacted negatively by the economic burden inflicted upon us, the money withdrawn through labor and other ways from African communities. The impoverishment has gone on from generation to generation to generation. There are other aspects of this that we need to talk about, but I want to say this. Too many Guyanese, including African Guyanese, believe that African Guyanese are relatively poor compared to other Guyanese because there's something wrong with us. That's not true. We have been impoverished because we've been deliberately starved of resources. When our people bought those villages, exhausted village land at inflated prices, and set up villages, Ravi started to mention, pigs were shot, fruit trees were cut down, our economic means was destroyed. Then taxes were placed upon us. We were not given loans when we sought loans. So this is a historic situation that we have not even begun to explain as scholars of our condition. And when many Guyanese people and others look at the situation in Guyana today, lots of racist nonsense is spoken because people say, well, this is how Africans are. And this leads me to something else. A lot of what Ravi said, to my mind, raises a very important question. Where do you start the history of African people? Our history did not begin when Europeans brought our ancestors in chains on the plantations of Guyana. Our history began when history began, because Africans are the first people in the world. The first civilizations, plural, were established by African people. So if we locate African people, enslaved or not, in our entire history, which is the correct thing to do, a question like African people needing to be trained by evil people to do menial tasks becomes irrelevant. It's the same thing like the governor of Florida today, DeSantis, saying that African people benefited from enslavement because we got skills. That's utter racist bunkum. How could the people who built the pyramids, who invented the sciences, who were building pyramids thousands of years before Europeans emerged from the caves, how could you tell me that these people benefited from the evil that Europeans, Western Europeans, did to us? The question becomes so stupid that you really shouldn't be posing it. But it only looks as though it's something with a little bit of sense in it, because we dislocate African people and begin our history with our enforced arrival in an enslaved condition in Western European society. So we negate all the African achievements, the invention of the calendar, the invention of other ways of measuring time, the invention of building and architecture. I mean, we could go on and on and on. There's a struggle over this today. Some racist Arabs in Egypt, like Zahi Hawass, they're claiming that the Africans, somehow or the other, the current occupiers of Egypt, the Arab people, were the ancient Egyptians. An elementary cursory glance at history will tell you that the current African population of Egypt and the rest of North Africa moved en masse into Egypt and the rest of North Africa after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him. So they couldn't be building things thousands of years before they got there. It's absolute nonsense. And unless we understand our history, a lot of racist nonsense is going to pass for something else, something decent. And I have to emphasize that we have to liberate ourselves from the European view, the Eurocentric view of our history. And that begins with liberating ourselves from restrictive and damaging terminologies. One or two more points. The Irish were the first colony of the English. And therefore, what tended to happen, lots of laws and so on, that the English tried on the Arabs and perfected, the Irish, and perfected in certain ways, they would impose on other people that they conquered. That's one. Two, the police force. It's a good point that I've made elsewhere, Ravi. The location of the police force wasn't where large estates were, although that's almost accurate. It was where African people established villages, because in the ordinance to establish the police force in Guyana, it was very clearly stated that these African people needed to be physically contained. What you're seeing there is the racist European mindset that said African people are violent people and they must, therefore, be contained physically. Now, this is important for another thing that you said. You know, when Europeans revolted against any oppressor, real or imagined, they weren't doing riots at all. These were revolutions or actions of some sort. We hear about the American Revolution. We don't hear about the American riots. And by the way, that wasn't a revolution, you know. It was a war of independence. You know, there wasn't any change in the social structure, right? So we accept other people's definition of reality. And it's a dangerous thing because it deprives us of agency. And that's very consistent with the state of enslavement that Europeans put us in and sought to keep us in. This is where mental enslavement becomes important. That's why I said what happened in 1834 was the legal termination of some physical aspects of enslavement. And this brings us to the two institutions that you mentioned, Ravi, the church and the school. You said that the church controls the school. Yes, but there's something deeper there. Who paid for the church? It was the African Guyanese and eventually other Guyanese who were taxed to pay. And what did they teach us in those churches and schools? Up to now, the European church in Guyana is in charge of the deepening mental enslavement of African people. There may be exceptions, but that's substantially what they're engaged in. And let's go to the beginning of the presence of the European church among African people in Guyana as elsewhere. What were the Europeans doing to us when they introduced that church to us? Let me give you a hint. When John Hawkins left England to begin the English leg of the enslavement of African people, he sailed on a ship. You know what it was called? The Good Ship Jesus. The Good Ship Jesus. Hawkins and others were having Christian prayers aboard that ship every day, sometimes more than once a day. They built forts. I just visited a fort in Ghana where they had a church atop the dungeons in which they held African captives. Now, this is what Christianity has done to us. And there's no defense against it. If people are committing the greatest crimes ever in human history, and in the midst of that, they force a religion on you, could that be for your benefit? Could that be for your benefit? And let me say this. If Christianity wishes to redeem itself, it will have to have a different relationship to the facts and to African people. There is more, because most of the doctrines of Christianity have their origins in Africa. And I could go into this. Maybe you need 2 other sessions for me to explain this. I'm not joking. If you go to Leviticus, for example, it's all African culture, the laws. I wrote a book on libation. People buying the book, they're asking me for it. They're inviting me to do lectures on it and so on. I went to Guyana a couple years ago, and the young people, young African Guyanese, literally ran out of a building because they claim that my explaining libation is really doing devil work. And those people are so confused and ignorant that they didn't realize that libation is mentioned in the Bible over 63 times as liquid offering, singular, and liquid offerings, plural. That's libation. And there are many other aspects of African culture that are reflected in the Bible. Now, my point is that Christianity does not own up to its origins or the parts of its origins in Africa. And I'm going to say this. If you take away what Christianity got from Africa, hardly anything will be left. Hardly anything will be left, except evil practices. So African people had skills, had morality. When Europeans first started going to Africa, if you read the travel dialogues, travel writings of many of the early travelers, they're always talking about how the place is orderly, the place is clean, these people are really advanced, and blah, blah, blah. So knowing the history of Africa is extremely important, because if we begin with African people in an enslaved condition, as John Henry Clark pointed out, then everything else will look like progress. If you're going to school after being prevented from going to school for hundreds of years, and you don't know that your ancestors invented school and university, invented education system thousands of years ago. I wrote a book on the education system in ancient Egypt. It's the first system of education in the world, bar none, from nursery to university. Okay? So if you don't know that, or anybody doesn't know that, it's easy for us to believe that when some Europeans say, oh, they must get training, this was progress. It wasn't progress. And we must not believe that nonsense. And this is another way in which I'm agreeing with Ravi. The system of education, the school, does not fulfill the needs of Guyanese people. We have to change that curriculum. So if you have a church whose main occupation was controlling the minds of African people, so we'll be passive and we won't revolt against our condition either of enslavement or of oppression anyhow in a post so-called enslavement society. If that's your mission, you're not fulfilling the needs of African people? Where is our history? Why mustn't a religion connect us to our own history and our identity? There's a whole area of inquiry that says that people who don't know their identity, their history, do not achieve as much as they could achieve their full capacity. So all these, to my mind, are relevant to our understanding of that moment of enslavement. One last thing about the police force again. The constitution of that police force tells you something. All the officers were white, and most of them were ex-British Army. African Guyanese or African people, some came from Barbados later on, and then there were Indians, weren't permitted to advance beyond the rank of a sergeant. These are things we should know about the police force. And yes, Ravi, from the inception, it was aimed against the working people of Guyana, first of Africans and later on of Indian Guyanese. And there is an area of investigation that we have to face too, because it's easy for people to see a colonial police force made up of African underlings being used to put down Indian insurrections on the estates. We got to talk about that. If we are not educating ourselves about that, what is education for? Well, I'm going to tell you. It's for the persistence of the design in the systems that Europeans enforced upon us, systems that were for their benefit, not for our benefit. Now we have the power and hopefully the knowledge and understanding. We need to change those systems.
Ravi?
Yeah, a point of clarification, and I agree with you pretty much with all you said there. On the police force is very important in terms of what happened 100 years later. Those early recruits, yes, all of the officers were whites, but practically all of the ranks were Barbadians. It is only later, because they did not trust, because the Bajans had come in, they'd gotten passage to come to work on their estates, and they were recruited because they did not trust the individuals, the ex-slaves in Guyana, to police their mati, as they call them. So the Bajans were there and feeling that they would follow orders. And it was only, for example, in 1885, I believe, 21 Indians were taken in, and they performed credibly, but they were not recruited again, because the whole point was this kind of divide and rule.
Exactly.
And we have to be, and this is when we started our agitation for change by the turn of the century. We focused on the police, because this was what replaced the violence of the planters on the Africans, and then the police force became the tools for the application of violence on the rest of that new society. So we have to be very upfront on this. So when we talk that the force must be representative of the Guyanese populace, we are making that same argument that should have been made from the very beginning, that why you got to bring in Bajans to put into the police force. You're being very callous in your assessment of what constitutes law and order. The order was simply for what you did, and the law was what you enacted. And so there was never any emancipation there. I want to come back to the whole notion of the church and education, because it is important for us to know that even though slavery, when the British took over from the Dutch in 1796 and finally in 1815, around the Napoleonic wartime, they had already been in India for almost a century, and they had pacified India. And it is not a coincidence that the most underdeveloped parts of India to today, to use Walter Rodney's term of the underdevelopment of Africa. It is not a coincidence that the most underdeveloped parts of India to date is the section called Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, from which most of the Indians in Guyana came from. Those lands were sucked like oranges, and the skin were tossed aside and left for them to make a living. So we come back to another nexus, this whole point about church and education. One of the foremost anti-slavery spokesperson was a fellow by the name of Zachary Macaulay. Zachary Macaulay is amongst them with Buxton and Wilberforce and all that, even though he's a bit older. But his son is Thomas Babington Macaulay, his son. And he was in India working for the East India Company, which at that point was ruling India. Imagine you had a private company ruling an entire nation like India and pretending as if it's not Britain. Oh, it's a private company. Be as it may, I want to come back to the younger Macaulay, Thomas. He, in 1835, laid the premises of what English education meant. And it's important we understand that today, because this was in 1835, before the end of apprenticeship and before the launch of all these schools in Guyana. In what is now called the Macaulay Minute presented to the Indian Parliament, Macaulay laid the premises of how they would govern their colonies. None of the knowledge in those colonies, whether be in India, Africa, or in Australia, it didn't matter where, none of that was worth even a single book. Macaulay said that one shelf in a British library was worth more than all the books of 5,000 years of Indian history. And you could then put that in for Africa. All the books found in Timbuktu would have been worth even a single book from England. So they were taught, and he said this explicitly in India, we were to create what he called brown Englishmen. So the epitome of what the Indian education would produce was a brown Englishman, meaning at the very best you could be an imitation of the real thing. Obviously, you could never be the real thing. So even after emancipation, when those schools were formed in Guyana, initially the English churches, right, they taught 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. What was the reading? The reading initially in Guyana was that same Bible. And as Kimani said, even if we don't want to accept Egypt, we know that where did the Queen of Sheba come from? We can't pretend about that. So the origins of the Bible predate by almost 1,000 years England. Yet these people would be teaching in the Bible class of a white God with gray beard hanging up somewhere in the sky, with a white Jesus that you should be praying to. And that was now going to be the church aspect. We come back to that. But the education now was that not any of your knowledge is considered knowledge. Education now with a capital E would all come from Europe. So the African notion of Ubuntu, let us say, in terms of seeing a human being as a result of a collective, nowadays it is now given as a matter of fact. There is no such thing as an individual. We are all the product of a community of all. No mind, you take a child and put it in the jungle, it's called a feral animal, right? And yet the West rejected, I'm talking about emancipation, so I'll talk about Ubuntu, the African notion of Ubuntu. Even today in Guyana, I don't hear any of the churchmen talking about these things. That is how much they derided African learning and African perspective in life. The fact that today we hear of environmentalism, how come it's still not accepted that the African and the Indian, in seeing the divinity in plants, in rivers, and in mountains, is not recognized as being forward thinking? Even today, now that you're trying to save the earth, even today they would not put it in those terms. Now suddenly environmentalism is a European discovery that we should now. So when we do a Dharti Mata Puja, Dharti Mata is puja to the earth. When the African does that, I call it a puja or libation to the ocean or to the earth, or to that is somehow black magic, obia. And of course, obia becomes, the worst thing you could do. And coming back to the voice of the slaves, there's one account that is recorded there. I have the citation at some later point. I was struck when I read it, that when one enslaved African was told about she having an original sin, which the church will help her to overcome, the woman asked, and this is the question she posed back, this enslaved African, how could I be born with a sin that I did not commit? Think of it. Think of it. It's a logical question, but Europe is supposed to be the home of reason, you see? And that enslaved woman was irrational for asking such a question. How dare you presume that there's no such thing as original sin? Ask any halfway dimwit that how could suddenly something you never did, right, that started some back in time, and I'm paying it for today. What nonsense. But to come back to Macaulay Minute, we should note that after teaching the 3 hours, when the money ran out for schools, right, and they brought in the monitorial system, you would take the brighter boys in the African class, make him a monitor, and he was supposed to teach. You get me? And that is how they passed it on, because he now is proud of his position. I'm a monitor. And he now become the transmitter of this nonsense about the blue-eyed baby Jesus. But to end this part of my presentation, where we have to re-examine the premises of education here. The first place where, and I've said this, I think, on this program before, where English literature was taught was in India. Even in England, it was not taught. They, of course, pretended that they were directly descended from the Greeks and Romans. You know, they really, to talk about people being hegemonized, it is 1,000 years of darkness, of a dark Europe never crossed their mind. But that's another story. But here now, they founded Queen's College in 1844, and bishops a few years later. And these schools were now the epitome of what learning is. So we all boast about being a product of Queen's College. And what did you learn in Queen's College? And what do you learn in Queen's College? When my 2 children, both of whom went to Queen's College, my daughter became a head prefect and all of that, she was taken to the headmistress for wearing this string that I have around my hand. She had one on. You get me? Because that was not in consonance with the Anglican foundation of that school. And this is in the 2000s. I am talking here about, buddy, 2000s.
Ravi, let me interject.
No, I wouldn't. You go on. Take over. Go on.
Yeah. Okay. So 1 second. We are running out of time. So Kimani, if you could just summarize, how do we go forward? How do we address this miseducation and lack of emancipation of the mind?
And church.
I suggest that we have a separate section to deal with that, a separate chat to deal with that. We shouldn't trivialize it and brush it into a 5-second corner. So the point I want to make is important for that. What we had wasn't really education, and it wasn't really religion in the church and the schools. What we had was a socialization process that attempted to replace the culture of whosoever was subjected to that with English standards and values. So we came to value whiteness. We came to value the ability to speak and run up our mouths and do correct grammar above anything else. We came to value the hair of white people above anything else. We came to value the color of white people above everything else. Because the standard, the core of racism in the Christian church, as well as in the English education system, began with the white middle-class man as the alpha. Anybody who was different from him was inferior to him to the degree of difference from him. So black people were far more different. European women were different, but less different than anybody else, but they were still oppressed, you know? So we need to understand what we need to emancipate ourselves from. And it's important that we get that right. Because if we don't know what we're fighting against, then how could our fight be successful? Decolonization is a process. It wouldn't end overnight. We still don't know enough about ourselves, a point that I made repeatedly on this program. You know, white people attack the indigenous knowledge systems of all their victims, whether it's in India, China, Africa, and so on. China has recovered substantially. India has recovered substantially. Africa has not really recovered. There's only a few African people in usually universities and study circles who understand some of the history of Africa. Let me give you an example. Ravi, you mentioned Ubuntu. Well, Ubuntu is a variation of what the ancient Egyptians call Ma'at. And Ma'at is found in societies before the establishment of ancient Egypt, societies in Africa, because some of those societies from the Nile Valley would feed into ancient Egypt. And they didn't leave their culture behind. They went with their culture there. They interacted with other Africans. The thing assumed certain dynamics because of local conditions, and it led to what we call civilization. But the foundational African identities, ways of doing things from further down in the Nile Valley and long before ancient Egypt. And African people weren't civilized a mere thousands of years before the Europeans. We could talk about over 5,000 years, because the book that would be substantially incorporated into the Bible, I'm talking about the book of Pret Em Heru, which in ancient Egyptian means something like the book of obtaining righteousness. Europeans call it the Egyptian book of the dead, and they say it means the book of coming forth by day. That's because they do not understand a word in the ancient Egyptian language. But we don't have time to go into that. If you go to that text, you're going to see where the 10 Commandments come from, the declarations of innocence. You're going to see where the ideas of heaven and hell come from. You're going to see where Judgment Day comes from. You're going to see where the ruler of the afterlife comes from. And there are many, many other aspects of Christianity today, sensing, born in incense, and so on. All of those things are in that text. But here's the important point. That text is an elaboration and development of another group of texts that are called the coffin texts, that are 3,000 years older. The coffin text is an elaboration and development of another text that was first written on the walls of the pyramids. Now we're talking about the first writings in the world. That's how old some of these precepts and concepts are. So we have an unbroken line of development known to some of us who could read and analyze that language. So, you know, African people were producing these ideas and acting on these ideas for thousands of years before the Europeans emerged from living in caves. You go to China, you go to India, you go to Native America, and you're going to find the same conditions. People had developed what we call high society long before Europeans. It doesn't mean that there weren't challenges in those societies. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that these were advanced societies, in some cases, more advanced than what we have today. For example, Native Americans had a clock that was more advanced than what we have today. You know, so these are issues that we need to understand. The destruction of the indigenous knowledge system of the cultures that Europeans impose themselves upon through violence. And yes, environmentalism is just one of those things. We could talk at length about environmentalism. I've published on environmentalism before the environmentalists. That's what my paper on environmentalism is called. And I mentioned something like Kina in Guyana, which comes out of that whole thing about what the Europeans call totems. You know, in Ravi's village, the totem might be the turtle. People don't eat the turtle, they don't kill it. It's a protective animal. Next village is another thing, protective animal. But you see, Europeans said that when we practice that kind of thing and other peoples practice them, once they weren't the way Europeans did, it was nonsense. It was backward, you know, and they used demeaning terms to describe other people and their cultural ways. Today, those very silly, stupid Europeans, they have almost destroyed this earth. And we have a crisis of environmentalism. Some people call it climate crisis. They're responsible for it. And we could have taught them to avoid that, because that's what our systems were about. So we have to do planet repairs today. And what's planet repairs? Is regreening the earth, is abstaining from certain destructive ways. You know, Europeans shot things, animals, for fun. How stupid could you be? In this continent I'm located on, North America, they practically eradicated the bison. They made mountains of the skulls of bison. They shot them wantonly. What kind of civilization is that? And we need to reflect on these things. And this is where one of our recommendations has got to be the recovery of the indigenous knowledge systems of the people who constitute Guyana, and especially African people who tend to know little or nothing much about ourselves in that way. But I'm going on.
Okay, so Ravi, can we wrap up? You want to summarize?
Yeah. I mean, we have said a couple of mouthfuls, but as Kimani keeps emphasizing, this is not something that we can do exhaust. And that's the whole point, I think, of these programs. We are hoping that the powers that be are listening or would listen, because at long last, we have the wherewithal to actually implement these programs. All we need is the political will and an acceptance of the premises of which we speak. I will talk about one aspect of what Kimani mentioned that I hadn't talked about, the colored class, the product of European rape of African women, which was standard. That was like basic, never even a second thought. But the irony in Guyana, and I was criticized terribly about when I wrote about this 20, 30 years ago in the Guyana papers, that so-called colored class that was created, they were then given an advantage by the rapist fathers. These children of rape were given an advantage. Many of them were given schooling in England and elsewhere. Many of them were given jobs. From my own village, I know that one of the overseers who made 4 children from a lady from my street, I will not call name, all of those children were given better education. The point I want to make is that I am old enough to know of a time when to be even a store girl at those days Booker store, you had to be you had to be fair. To be a bank clerk, a teller, you had to be a certain color. You get me? It was that bad. So imagine where you can live. And Dai has written a book. Her dad was a doctor, but he was dark skinned. His mother was very fair. She literally had a breakdown, and Dai and I spent many sessions talking about this. She was very candid, and it's all down in a book, right? That was published posthumously, of her breakdown in trying to deal with the pressures on someone in a family who wasn't fair enough, to go to Bishop's High School in those days and to be looked, never mind she might be the brightest girl in the class, to be then put down not being one of the popular girls. These are not inconsequential things I want to say. This is a reality in Guyana even today. And I look at some of those who still want to lead us and look at some of their premises which we want them to speak for us. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to blame the child of the rapist, but that child of the rapist should be cognizant of our reality enough to, in many ways, give way to those whom they put down. The greatest enemy of the African in Guyana was the colored strata. That those Africans strove, that their ideal was that if you had to become fairer, so you marry up. So the dark-skinned black girl, is doomed. You get me? You had to now speak properly, as Kimani said, to curl up your tongue and imitate those people. So when I be talk like this, and I be talk like Mati, and I be do this, and I be do that, that is terrible. I faced this as late as 1970 when I went to Georgetown for the first time to do A-levels. Somehow, even the broken ones, the broken words, water, somehow became better than water. You understand? True story, Kimani.
I come from Mexico, so I was subjected to all of that. Plus,
yes.
Where am I here? How I do?
Yes. So to conclude this, I want to talk that these are not just theoretical things. The schooling, the police, the colored presumptions, where we stand. It's like Rafi Dev. How, look, I'm darker than Kimani. So growing up, you said, the boy nice, but he dark. You get me? But is called an eraser word. Nice, of course, in those days, we don't know the word handsome, nice. So these are realities, unfortunately, that still confront our new societies, because you go to see Barbie, which everybody is seeing. And some of these, while they might have made the president as Barbie, that to me is irony, because we did have a black president in America. But as Cornel West would argue, what exactly did he do for black people? I don't want to go down that road, but my boy Cornel is running for president.
Could I jump in here for one moment?
No, don't. I like Cornel. Cornel's my boy. So he can talk. So the black Barbie president didn't do much. So let me conclude. What I'm saying is that emancipation is basically an emancipation, as I said the last time, I'll conclude here, that emancipation did nothing. It was formed during the colonial times, and today, like I said, the scholars call it coloniality, and they have left with us the hierarchies of race. And I always come back, people blame, well, Koli people are looked down on black people. But if you go to Ukraine, as I said, they didn't want, the Polish didn't want the blacks studying in Ukraine to cross their border. Right? There were no Koli people over there. You go to China, you go to South Korea, not many Africans. So what has happened is that this modern thing called education, which comes out of the Macaulay Minute, has permeated the entire world. And therefore, we are all now already fixed in this grand chain of being. So if we are to address our problems in Guyana, we have to look systemically and get a grasp of it. And this comes from changing our entire educational system. Thank you. I'm done.
Okay, so Kimani, you could have your last word and then we close.
Yeah, there are a couple of things we would need to include in our discussion. And one is the caste system in India. We have to ask a question. Has that caste any cloud on how Indian people see other Indians or other people who may or be darker or lighter than them. It's a question we need to face. We also have to bring in other things, not necessarily contentious things, from the indigenous knowledge systems of our constituent communities, cultures, that may be acting upon our consciousness today. I think we've made a good start. I think that we're beginning to look at ourselves in ways that are far more questioning and inclusive of all the experiences that may have gone into the making of us as we are today. The last thing I would say is that we have to recognize that it was Jagan and Burnham who put a stop to the colored girls. You know, you had to have a bit of color before you're a bank clerk and that kind of thing. You know, and we have to give praise to our elders when that praise is due. It doesn't prevent us from being critical about them, but we have to keep our social memory intact. And it is when Burnham, Jagan, Quayana, Janet Jagan, Martin Carter, and that group of people came into power, they started to say this nonsense must stop. And that's a good place to stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very wonderful session on emancipation. And as you said, we need a whole session on a solution to address emancipation questions. Gentlemen, thank you all very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight and watching, listening to Globespan24x7 with Devin Bissoon as our coordinator, techie operator, and Mr. Nohar Singh as the owner operator of Globespan24x7. Thank you. Good night.